Welcome, everyone. Welcome to FARSIGHT Friday. My name is Farah Bala. My pronouns are she, her. I am the founder and CEO of FARSIGHT. We are a leadership and organizational development consultancy that prioritizes concepts, practices, and behaviors of EDIA, which for us is equity, diversity, inclusion, anti-oppression. FARSIGHT Friday is our community podcast that we started back in 2020. And these have since become very crucial listening and learning spaces for all of our listeners. And our focus is really to introduce, interrogate, unpack topics, concepts, vocabularies that are really current to our times, that enhance, deepen spaces of inclusion, belonging, whether in our communities, whether at work. Today's conversation around relationality at work and the role it plays in building, creating, enhancing healthy work culture. And I am so excited to introduce our two esteemed guests, Dr. Saliha Bava and Mark Greene. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. You are also the authors of your newest offering, The Relational Workplace, which I'm very excited to ask you about in a second. But first, I'm going to hand it over to both of you. Yes, I have it here as well. Saliha, where's your copy? We all share.
Nobody told me. Here we go. Let's hold it up. There we go. So that's
perfect.
I am Saliha Bava, and I am originally from India. I've been living in the US for nearly about the equal amount of time that I was in India. And I came here for my PhD in marriage and family therapy. So by training, I am right now I'm a couples therapist and a consultant on relationships. My training is in systemic practices and human development. I currently teach. I'm a full professor at Mercy University, and I teach in their marriage and family therapy program, which is within the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences. And I run a lab that I started called the Relational Play Lab, which is where we inquire into how we as human beings improvise. How do we make up the world? Like this conversation, as much as we've prepared and talked about where it may go, there's an element of improvisation here that's going to come into play. And so how do we do that on a daily, everyday basis? And in the process of doing it, how do we create the sense of self, the world around us, and the different context? And so I study relational practices in communities and families. And I've been in this work for 30 years or so as a relationship consultant. And I worked as a consultant both within and from outside with organizations. So traditionally, what might one recognize it as organizational development consultant. So I've done a lot of leadership coaching. Currently, my practice, I would say, has a lot of leaders from the financial industry, because being in New York City, I get a lot of clients from that. And we go from everything from one's identity to how do I position myself as a leader, to talking about group processes and where there are disjuncts. So I do a lot of different things because I don't like to be boxed in, but more so because I am an interdisciplinary and a transdisciplinary researcher, because I think the way we have created research and the world around us is very boxed, and we learn from stepping in and out of those, call me a boundary transgressor in academic disciplinary sense, now to live in the liminal plane, the liminal space of the in-betweenness, because I think that's where we find the richness by which what we're going to talk about today. How do we transition through challenges and pain points and identity and culture conversation where there are a lot of differences and power differentials?
My name is Mark Greene. About 20 years ago now, I began writing about fatherhood and being a stay-at-home dad. That quickly became a strong interest in our culture of masculinity, what we call man box culture or dominance-based masculinity. And I have a significant amount of writing and publishing, speaking, consulting, and coaching around those issues. But if you look at the challenge of dominance-based masculinity long enough, You can pretty much find the sources of it, name it, define it, show how it's showing up. But at some point, the question became, so what do we do about it? And that led me to my partnership with Saliha Bava around relational practices, which are the processes by which we create relational spaces with others and grow connection and equity and creativity and all of the things that we need to move past dominance-based hierarchical systems. So that's what brought me into this work, and that's what we've been doing for the last few years, is really researching and writing about this.
My first question to both of you is, both of you are very accomplished in your fields. Both of you have had research out there. You were published. What motivated you to write this book? Was it a conversation, an event, an experience of being boxed in, and then the process of, writing this book, The Relational Workplace?
Three things, primarily: experience, gap, and the time. By experience, I think when you write a book, there is a process by which you synthesize. So I've been doing this work, like I said, for 30 years. One of my first jobs when I graduated in India was working in rural India with tribal, what we would consider the tribal belt of India, or the indigenous population. Now, that's a very different name, what it means in India, than what it means here in the US when we say indigenous. So again, another conversation for another time. But as an urban woman coming into rural, what does that mean to work in two different contexts? And we were working in organizing working groups for, you could call it human rights and land rights and economic rights. So we were organizing women and youth groups for these rights, right? So when I said I do organizational work, I consider that as organizational work because we're organizing. So this idea that organizations are structures is something that we understand as one way of thinking about organizations. My work has been in the activity of making an organization, the activity of organizing, which we tend to think about, oh, that's community organizing, and this is social organizing, and this is organizations. And I blur those distinctions because it's human beings organizing in different contexts to give it different names and different functions that are responsive to the context. So that experience from there till date today, and at Mercy College for the last 2 years, I've been organizing with my university, with my organization as an insider. I'm a full-time faculty member, but I don't have an administrator role. I mean, I serve on committees and I'm a chair for administrator position for 2 to 3 years or something like that. But in terms of the initiative I'm talking about, at Mercy, we are developing an inclusive pedagogy course. So how do we do this course development? How do we pull, what are the values we value? So we're trying to develop the Mercy model. Whose voice matters? How do we bring in the different conversations around diversity, equity, inclusion? Everything from practices to language gets really quirky very quickly because somebody's voice doesn't matter or gets sidelined, right? So these are all ways by which I've been in organizations, and writing a book is about making sense of all that at one level, what matters. So that's experience, and there's so much more, but I'm just bookending the two experiences. The second I said was gap. As a researcher, I think I have an inquiry mindset. It's like, wake me up at the middle of the night and I'll start talking to you about research. I was always the go-to gal on explain stats to me. How do I do this research analysis? I love being in inquiry. One of the gaps that I was noticing, especially as more and more racial and social justice has been since the start of the pandemic, but even before that, for those of us who've been working in the field, we know it's been there for a long time that these justice movements have been in play. There's a particular gap that happens when we do analysis of injustice, and that is a structural analysis gets analyzed. And the gap that I saw was there wasn't as much conversation or language around the discursive, which is what happens when we are engaging one another systemically what is happening, not just in our interpersonal, but interactionally, what's happening. So we'll come back to what's the distinction between interactional and interpersonal. But that gap is another thing that this book led me to, which is we need to speak, because that's a place of resourcefulness that this country, this time, this culture is struggling with. And that was the time was calling for how to be more resourceful, how to be more responsive, how to be in these dialogues to create a different social condition that not only rights the wrong, but also going forward, we don't continue to replicate those injustices. So how do we do this work in these times without getting split by those divisions? And the divisiveness of these times, I felt the community I belong in, so the social constructionist, I belong in 2 networks, and we'll put the link in for you all for later. The Taos community, Taos Institute, and then there is some larger community called the International, it's an international network of collaborative and dialogic practitioners. We have been swimming in these ideas for 50 years or so, right? And so how do we bring that? And so all of that is what came into this being of the book.
I think what's important to understand is that the work that we do around relational capacities has an outward facing piece, but it also has very much a piece where it's my own journey to try to understand what, as a man raised in white culture in America, what I was taught about how to be successful and how to move through the world. And like many men at my stage in life, about 10 years ago, everything had fallen apart one more time. And I began to ask myself, what am I doing? And what do I keep doing over and over again that's failing, that's problematic? And what I discovered was I really had no fundamental understanding of how to be in relationship with other human beings. I mean, it comes down to that. And I think that's what man box culture creates in our lives, dominance-based masculine culture creates for so many men, is this sense that we're supposed to model hierarchy, dominance, independence, individualism, toughness, power over women and girls, be a breadwinner, not a caregiver, don't show your emotions. All this construct of being a man had stripped me of connection. And I always felt a deep-seated anxiety about being a man, that I wasn't doing it right, that I was going to get called out by the other men around me, policed and bullied and all that. But also that that my relationships always were a little bit distant, didn't last, fell apart. My friendships, yeah, I have friends. When's the last time you talked to one? 3 years ago. That's my good friend. I talk everything, like the whole construct of masculinity led me to wonder how I could learn better ways to be in relationship. And that's when Saliha's work around relational capacities, and we're going to go into some specific relational capacities today. But those, when they were explained to me, I thought, well, that's simple and elegant and beautiful, and I'm going to try that. And I began trying these different capacities. We have them on our relational wheel, and it transformed my life.
I want to talk about vocabulary for a second. We are very familiar with the term relationship, building relationship, deepening relationship. Relationality is different.
Yeah.
You type it in to an email or Google, it's going to have that little red squiggly line. It's still not, because
it's not part of the cultural discourse.
It's not.
Or the lexicon. Yeah.
So let's start at the very beginning, a foundation, I should say. Can you help us understand the distinction between relationality and relationship?
I'll say that at the simplest level, relationality is a way of orienting to the world and how we make sense of the world, where we center relationships, and I'll talk about that, and the activity of relating. So if you think about relationship as 2 people coming and forming a third entity, like when people come together and form an organization, then the organization becomes an entity. It's still an entity. And then you get much more structural with it. You think in terms of roles and responsibilities and structures. Relationality takes us further into thinking about how are we co-designing, co-creating this thing that we're calling relationships. So we start orienting to the activity or the process of relating. And relationality, for the way I'm positioning it, and again, as researchers go, we all love to say, what's your operational definition? What do you mean? And that's why one has to be kind of thoughtful as to who is speaking about it, for whom, and from where are they speaking. So ask 3 different people in this work, and we'll be all talking about it slightly differently. But part of the world making process is we try to elevate and come up with a singular definition. For me, that's part of the dominance-based hierarchy process that we're all swimming in, by which we think there has to be one way of talking about it. Why? The reason is so we can have some shared understanding. So that's part of relationality, which is how do we create, through these processes, how do we create shared understanding, shared meaning, and shared ways of going forward, while recognizing that knowledge making, and language is very social. So relationality is a word that's coming into being. Now Google it, and you'll find it's coming into being more and more. To put it simply, is centering relationship and the history of relationships and the art of making.
Thing that for me that's really powerful about relational capacities or relational ideas is that it directly challenges what is essentially a socially structured, reinforced culture of individualism, especially in America. And this idea of bootstrap, pull yourself up, anything that you succeed at in this world, you have to do on your own or you didn't do it, is actually a cultural inoculation done by the Republican Party over the past 40 years, beginning with Reagan, which was designed to convince Americans that we are all individuals, and anyone who needs help is relying on the social net, safety net, and they wanted to get rid of that social safety net. So we've been told over and over again this bootstrap culture of individualism is what makes a real American. That also ties directly into hierarchical dominance-based masculinity, where if we're going to succeed in the world, we have to dominate everyone around us, and if we fail to do that, we lose status. So when we talk about relationality, what we're saying is that it's not just that we form relationships as individuals, but that when we are in the process of relating, the moment by moment back and forth of expression, of tonality, of the context of the conversation, of our collective histories, something new is emerging between us, is getting created. So if you want to think about relational intelligence, you can think of it as, oh, I know how to do relationships well. I have relational intelligence. Or you can look at it as a much bigger entity, that when you have an organization where that organization is seen through the lens of a network of relationships, and that organization orients part of its DEI work and part of its efforts toward growing a healthy network of relationships, what comes out of that network is a collective relational intelligence. And it shows up as innovation. It shows up as a sense of belonging. It shows up as energy and creativity and better business outcomes. So relationality gets us out of the box of social isolation, and loneliness in America is nothing short of catastrophic, as is loneliness in the workplace. And I'll give you a little bit of data here. Cigna did a study in 2020, and what they found was that 62% of U.S. workers may be considered lonely. In other words, taken as a percentage of the number of employed adults in the U.S., there are 97 million lonely workers. And they're estimating, Cigna, that this is costing American business 406 billion with a B, $billion a year in productivity and lost time. And when Cigna did a study to try to figure out how to counter this catastrophic level of loneliness in the workplace, which could be described as disconnection, not belonging, all of the sort of suppression of self that shows up in some workplaces, what they discovered was personal connectivity, being able to, and I'm quoting now, being able to share personal thoughts and concerns with colleagues, feeling free to be our true self at work, close quote. That was one of the solutions to this desperate level of loneliness. And when we talk about relational practices, what we're talking about is creating that kind of connection, creating relational spaces, belonging, that people are looking for in the workplace. And that's why this piece, if it is indeed $406 billion in losses a year, it's not a nice to have. It's crucial to businesses' survival.
To attack loneliness at work is not workshopping it or putting another program in place. It is attending to the network of relationship and conversations at your workplace. And it is from positional leaders at the highest positions to functional unit leaders to everybody as potentially a leader who can say, I want to do something about this. So relationality is really about attending to our interactions and everyday conversation and how it is shaped by our social spaces and how the social spaces and the scripts that we have get reshaped by these interactions and conversations. So in the way we are talking about relationalities, attending to the flow of recursivity, of the making, the process of how I am made by this conversation and how this conversation is being made by me, the back and forth of it.
On a larger level, that recursive piece, the systems and structures that make up an organization, were originally born out of conversations. The thing about relating and relationality is it's always happening. It's not something you decide to do, it's always happening. The question is whether we're mindful about what goes on in the relational spaces that get created, or whether it's just going willy-nilly along and often going off the rails, or we fall into the pattern of seeking dominance in those moments, or any of the many ways that relationality can either be conscious and thoughtful and intentional or not. And one of the things about our relational wheel and the capacities on it is we know from experience and from conversation that people recognize things they're already doing. So what we're really saying about relating is some of these things are going to sound familiar to you. All we're saying is name them, bring them into the light, and make them more intentional. So when we get to those, we really do have a list of ways to do this, to enter into that space, to begin becoming more mindful.
We have the capacity to be moved and impacted by what is happening in a conversation, while at the same time also having the capacity to impact and move others in conversation and the conversation itself, right? And the nebulousness of it, the non-linear, the non-concrete, boxed in space of it is where the magic, the improvisation, the play happens if we allow it to, right? And then the other piece is if we are thinking through ego, if we're thinking through power, seniority, that's when control comes in, and that starts shifting and shaping things differently. We've kind of created an umbrella of what is relationality, what is relational intelligence. It's the moment to moment micro ways of how I put how in like bold, uppercase, underlined, right? How we show up to one another. So introduce us to your 6 capacities.
The capacities on the relational wheel, and I'm just going to name them in order real quick. When we talk about stay playful, listen with curiosity, reframe our stories, consider context, ask questions, and hold uncertainty, what we're doing is we're setting ourselves up to be receptive and to have a conversation in which we don't have to have the answers and know and understand the story of others, and we can learn them instead. These relational capacities are designed that you could read about them in our book and try them right away, that it's not complicated. And all the relational capacities on our wheel relate to each other. They interconnect, you can combine them. There's a lot you can do with them, but they're all complementary to each other. But one of them is called listening with curiosity. And this is what we mean by that. We all carry stories about people. Let's say someone in our workplace that we've worked with for a number of years, someone in our family, someone in our community, but we're focusing on the workplace right now. So we carry a story about someone. And I'll say I carry a story about Frank in accounting, and I have to go talk to Frank about a budgetary issue. And I have a sense of, who Frank is and what his style of business is. And I sort of have a sense of, how he's going to respond to this conversation. So if I instead say to myself, I'm going to go in and I'm going to expect to be surprised and to learn something new that I'm really happy to have learned. I take that mindset on. I go in and I sit down with Frank and we start doing this exchange, this conversation, this process of relating in the moment by moment. Now, every conversation that we engage in with anyone has multiple threads, right? 10, 12 threads, maybe a lot more. One of those threads is going to carry the thread of the story that we have about that person. It is a predictive thread. It's a thread where we feel like, yeah, that's what he's probably going to say, and I sort of expect that, and so on. So as the conversation proceeds, different threads are visible. Some are very small threads, very new ideas. Think of them as green growth, little bits of green growth in the conversation. Other parts will confirm that narrative that we have about Frank in accounting. If we ignore those little green shoots of change and keep paying attention to those statements that confirm our predictive narrative, then that conversation is going to go pretty much the way that we expect it to. But if we instead say, hey, Frank, that's a really interesting idea over there. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? What we're doing is we're setting aside our predictive narrative and listening with a truly open mind to the various ideas that come up. And what we're also doing is acknowledging something crucial. And this can be in personal or business relationships. People are not static. People are evolving and emerging and changing all the time. And if we try to keep those predictive narratives in place about people, we will feel an increasing disconnection from them. So in relational practices, we instead look at the little green shoots. We get new ideas. We say, hey, you know, that Frankie's got some pretty innovative ideas about how to go forward with this or that aspect of a project. I'm going to start leaning on Frank for some more innovative ideas. And in that moment, the story we have about Frank shifts towards something that will make Frank feel more acknowledged and confirmed, and also allows me to feel more connected with Frank. So we grow the relational space with that person.
So I think even just the story, if we take it up, is to consider context, right? Where, what is my context with this person, with Frank, right? Where does Frank come from? So context is both situational, historical, social, and what we are co-creating with each other. So the context is always emerging, but it's also there in how we come in. Often at workplaces, we think about context as project. What's the my role context, right? And so it's this way of thinking about context as being much more broader. When you think about listening with curiosity, part of that is asking questions, which is one of the third practices. Asking questions, a lot of people ask questions sometimes to confirm what they are already coming in with. And we are saying ask questions that allow for plurality of voices, plurality of perspectives to come forth. And what that means is, as you were talking earlier, you have to let go of control. So when you think about that, I'm not driving this, are you saying I'm not going to be taking this conversation in the direction of where we need to create our project goals are there, we have a timeline? We're saying from that conversation, for that moment, consider suspending that drive and be in this place of co-creation and co-design, where you're asking questions to which you don't have the answers yet. You're asking questions so that you are allowing for what people will call as divergent thinking to appear, right? And what this way of being requires, and it is a way of being, it's a practice, it's not a technique. It's not like, oh, now I'm stepping in and asking questions. Now I suspend and I go away. No, you're talking about making a culture. It requires getting curious about what is your relationship to uncertainty. Because what we are recommending is you have to learn how to embrace and hold uncertainty. And I was just this morning in a conversation with a couple of other folks who are relationship consultants. And we were talking about how we are not trained culturally, socially, we are not trained. We don't have the ethos of embracing uncertainty. We are instead told to avoid uncertainty. And yet all of life is uncertainty. And if one thing has come out of the pandemic, it's uncertainty. So use the next few years, months, weeks, whatever it takes for you to start really exploring how am I relating to uncertainty? And how can I see it as a creative constraint, something that I can lean into and make with somebody else, right? And part of all of this, when we start engaging in conversations, when we engage in curiosity, when you're considering context, listening with curiosity, we will find ourselves as being able to reframe our stories. But as a researcher of play, as a researcher of improvisation, I'll say it takes the presence of being playful. And what I mean by that is holding our ideas lightly. So here's an example of an organizational context where I'm going to talk about how I engage my organization in inclusive pedagogy, right? I came in because they said, go ahead, you be the faculty lead. I came in with the modules you're going to have, 4 or 5 modules, etc. And we had been working for 3 or 4, I would say close to 3 months. And then the director of this, she's the director of teaching and learning, and I think she'll be okay with me sharing the story because we are going to be actually doing a presentation on it in another conference. She and I were socializing these ideas, meaning we were taking these ideas, talking to other stakeholders in the organization, everybody from the president's office to the provost's office to other offices who were functional unit heads who would have either input or be impacted by this. I was speaking to my dean, for example, as an organizational head of my school, and people were giving us ideas. And in the process, my idea of what we wanted to do in terms of the modules kept changing and shifting. And at one point, I looked at it myself and I said, wait a minute, are they taking me seriously? They told me to come in. I came in. Now what's going on here? And Mark will be a person who can attest to it. I took a few days to sit with that. And I went back with curiosity and asked some more questions. Help me understand where we're going with it. What's going to happen here? What about this? But I went in asking questions not to fault them, but to really learn and listen for what is emerging for them. And that's what I mean by staying playful. I had to hold my ideas lightly. I had to lean into my uncertainty of what might emerge. And at the same time, I understood that our context is changing. We have a new provost, we have a new president, we have lots of newness coming in, and people are juggling multiple tasks. I had to expand the context of what our timeline is going to be and how. So my story of what was going to be the project of inclusive pedagogy shifted of what it should be to something else. I'm still the project lead 2 years later, and we're getting ready to launch. And it's really exciting. So I hope this gives an example of how anybody can practice these relational practices. And we said, Farah, like you were saying, is it our control? Is it our ego? There are different languages we can bring. We like to bring this language because I think it's less entity-based and more interactive-based, if that makes sense. I think we live in a world where we make it I, me, myself. Either we blame us or we blame the other. And we're saying, no, these are processes. These are not just personality-driven events. These are relationally co-designed events, including what is curiosity, questions. We create a culture of shared understanding of how to do inquiry in the way we all show up.
And I love that you start with stay playful. As someone whose background is in theater, science of play, tools of theater and improvisation and learning environments, these are what these practices that you are uplifting is the foundation, right? Anyone, with our clients, sometimes I'll say, go take an improv class, go do some storytelling, because all of these different aspects just come to the fore. How do you, when you're improvising a scene, you don't know where it's going to go. I mean, there is no better lesson in holding uncertainty. Yeah. And then listening with that space of and building with, right? So in the improv world, we say accept and build with what you are getting. And this example that you just shared, Saliha, is exactly that. You came from your perspective. It started going in a different direction. It was still building with your idea, but it started looking very different. And then it suddenly doesn't matter because it's still fulfilling a need, right? The success of which the project is still here. It's still present. You're still leading it. And this, it doesn't have to be all of what I say, but if it can churn something there, if it can help move a conversation in a different direction, have us think about something that we've not thought of before when we're about to create some policy. We have to have space for this. And these 6 practices that y'all have named are so important, especially it's when we start hearing people, in that graph that you shared when you were screen sharing. It's okay that you get mixed messaging sometimes from your organization. It's okay that one group is saying this and the other is saying that. It's just based on their experiences. But what can we learn from that? What is a theme that we can build into a potential policy or a system that allows both perspectives to coexist together, right? To your point of the living in that plurality, or surfacing plurality, normalizing it, so that it's not just one way of doing this. For me, this is more about practice than expertise, and humility. You have to have humility, a quality of humility to be able to say, I'm here, and we will go somewhere in conversation. We will still get to wherever we end up getting collectively, right? And I'm just, again, I might be reframing, right, to one of your practices, but these 6 are really, really important, to that help us just sit with each other. The other piece, speaking of plurality, something that you all talk about in the book is how relationality helps. It's almost like the antidote to, or not, it builds a bridge to connecting through difference. So I'd like to move us into that space of conversation around, based on the work that you've done, your research, your experiences, how does relationality become the superpower in having the difficult conversations? How can relationality help move us collectively through a place of resistance?
If we're going to talk about difficult conversations, we have to decide what our understanding of a conversation is. If a conversation is something that gets co-created, and as I'm shaping the conversation, you're also shaping it, and in that moment, as I'm shaping you, you're shaping me, it's a change moment. It's actually an evolutionary process. Individually, we begin to see everything as connected, and the network is all in, because every conversation that person's had over the last few days is going to be flowing through us, and everything that we bring from our own history is flowing through them. And so this network becomes a living thing. And in that context, we begin to grow our relational capacities as intuitive and natural. They stop being something, oh, I have to remember to consider context, and it just becomes intuitive, becomes part of how we relate. So difficult conversations get a lot easier when we're there to learn instead of there to explain or control outcomes or what have you. I know, because I've messed enough of them up to feel that hot flush of embarrassment and fear and anxiety and all the things that get dumped on us, especially as men, to ever admit that we're wrong or that we've mishandled something.
If I may, I want to play devil's advocate. What do you say to someone who, is coming into what they perceive as being a difficult conversation, is very emotionally charged with whatever the history is, based on what might have happened or what the topic of discussion is, and comes from the mindset that I have to focus on I and my message, because I have to get this message across. Because difficult conversations is where we are in our most survival headspace, right? I have to get this out. It's less about I need to be heard, but I have to be right? And that's when all of those reframes start meshing into each other.
Right.
So when you're in that moment, right? You gave the example of flushed with fear and embarrassment. What can you do?
I have to expand out of just that this being an emotional moment.
Right.
We're not talking about emotionality, right? Difficult conversations can be, they're difficult because there's positional power, right? There is social power. Difficult, it can be, I'm feeling uncertain because I'm a newcomer to this organization or to this unit. You've gotten into making meaning. That's one of the things that we're talking about, that when we do work and think about DEI, we are doing work both at the structural level and at the discursive level. And we have to attend to both as if I don't know how many people are DI practitioners here, and even if you're a leader, you have to be orienting to both. So the work we're talking about as relationality is a mindset change, which is you want to notice what is coming into emergence, how is meaning being made, what language is being used, and how is all this directing my interaction with you.
My masculinity work takes me onto social media a lot. And I share a lot of theory and ideas about dominance masculinity and about the need for connection and all the stuff that I talk about. But it is not uncommon that someone will come back to me on social media in ways that are extremely aggressive and extremely triggering and extremely triggered. Now, what I find used to happen is I would immediately get like, again, have that physical, that somatic response in my body. I would get frustrated. I would get afraid about what comes next. Now, because I've been in this relational wheel space, and by the way, these 6 capacities are just 6 that we picked. There are many, many more relational capacities out there, and your wheel might have different things on it. But I immediately lean into the question of context. I say, okay, what's going on for this person in terms of what's leading them into this moment? And then I say, I go even further out and I say, well, they're not wrong about what they're saying, but they're really angry at me. If that's the case, then I say there may be some significant trauma in their experience of the world about this issue, at which point I back way the hell off explaining myself. And I just respond to say, okay, man, I hear that. I absolutely hear that. And I want you to know I support you on that frame. That's a very important point you're making. We can move and orient to our perception of the situation without necessarily taking a stand. Instead, we bring in all these other factors and consider them. And in a workplace argument, in a family challenge, etc., I find that I bring these relational capacities in much more quickly, and they help me keep my breath rate at a reasonable place. My heart rate comes down a little bit, and I say, I think there's a conversation out ahead of me here. I don't know what it is, but I think that conversation could help both of us grow our understanding of each other, but I need to make space for that to happen.
This is so connected to our evolution as a human being. And we're going to talk about trauma and somatic spaces and, how our body responds up next. There is a space that if we are coming from a place of trauma and our specific story that we are telling ourselves and believe to be true, we don't have the capacity to look at where the other person's coming from, right? Our capacity for empathy, to put ourselves in their shoes is just not there or minimal.
So as a trauma therapist, I don't just look at the trauma in the person. I look at it in the responsiveness. And that's relationality. Our capacities ebb and flow based on what's going on in our environment. This is why we look at toxic workplaces and say that stresses kill us, right? It's not my resiliency is lacking. It's the organization is expecting me to be superhuman while they continue to dump on me. That's what racism is. I'm subhuman and you can continue to dump on me because you have framed me as subhuman. And at the same time, you make me out as I'm not doing good enough to cope with it.
I would say we're fully aligned because it's in the responsiveness, right? It's not in the trauma and how it's showing up for ourselves, but how we're showing up to someone, in how we respond, in how we react.
How do we socioculturally understand trauma? What's left in and what's taken out, right? So a lot of people are now saying, wait, adverse childhood experiences is part of how we have capacity or don't have capacity. How we are socially treated. If every day I have to come to work as a woman in India, when I used to take the bus, I was a sexualized object. If I'm coming to work feeling totally dumped upon and sexually reduced to this object, you think I have the capacity to walk in and just come turn on? That's what we're talking about, is the social relational way we locate our ideas and practices. That we cannot just individualize that which is social relational in nature and expect as an organization that our people will do well by reducing them to the people who make the change and not look at our organizational practices by which we engage every day. And it can sound very big and aspirational, but it's not. That's why this work is getting so important at this time, because people in business are saying we're not just cogs in the wheel. We are social beings, and it matters how we show up and how you treat us and how you show us dignity and respect. And that's what I think, if people are looking for research, I would say check out the Glassdoor Culture 500 research from MIT. And they talk about this as the 3 factors that are the most powerful predictors of toxic behavior in workplace is toxic leadership, toxic social norms, and poor work conditions. And when you break down poor work conditions, it's role ambiguity, role conflict, workload, and lack of empowerment, right? These are all social relational in nature, but it's also organizational culture.
And one of the biggest challenges in sort of dysfunctional workplace dialogues it comes in again from the masculinity culture side, which is to always know, always have the answers, always be the person who understands everything. And often masculine style business dialogue collapses almost immediately in a DEI context, because the very first thing that happens is every assumption we carry about others, instead of making inquiries and holding uncertainty and listening with curiosity and not needing to sound like we already know, we start projecting ideas on people that are insulting to them and frustrating for them, and that are debilitating and difficult to dig your way out of once they happen. The systemic and structural DEI work, putting in place those DEI systems, are crucial to making DEI happen. In fact, all of our relational support for that wouldn't have much of an impact if those systems and structures hadn't been put in place. The only other thing that we like to call out here is that it took a relational process to bring those systems and structures to come to agreement, to understand how to best make them written up and enforced and offered and provided and so on. So we're not saying this instead of all the groundwork that's been laid. What we're saying is that once those systems and structures are put in place, individual employees are bumping into each other in the halls and trying to understand what it means to be in a new kind of conversation, to be invited into something more, because originally we were never invited to talk about race or sexual identity or neurodiversity or anything else. In fact, it was prohibited in the workplace, which is why one of the biggest challenges people have in the workplace is, I don't feel like I can show up as my whole self. I'm doing the covering thing. We want to create a culture where people feel like they have the ability to not mess the conversations up. And people who look like me are especially worried about this. Like, I don't know how to talk to people who may be from a different racial or a different religious or a different geographical background. So I'm just going to be quiet. And so what we're saying is, you have the structural policies and procedures, but also, where is ADEI work happening? It's happening in the daily conversations. So think of it as the structural and the interactional meeting, and the interactional moving through all these more complex interpersonal interactions, including things like microaggressions, status and power, team culture, unconscious bias. All of those things get understood and get explored through the back and forth of daily relating.
To underscore what he just said, Mark said, that these things come out of our everyday conversations. How should we do this? The simple question that Farah was saying. So how do you make it happen, right? And so what we're going to offer are some threads that I think they're always already engaged in, but making it more aware so that we are intentionally engaging them. So we are much more present to not just what's going on for me, but what's going on for us. What are we creating here together? And it is not to say that these things are not relational. It's to say that often leaders are thinking in terms of, so what HR is supposed to do? What's our policy supposed to be? And leaders also need to be thinking about how are we socially norming? How are we thinking about being a team and a culture.
You have this great chapter in your book titled How the Body Responds. Now, this is mental health, the term trauma responses, all of this, again, in this last decade is gaining more and more presence, momentum and context in how we are talking about oppression and the antidote towards creating more health within organizations. Can you tell us a little bit, based on your research around this mind-body connection? You already talked about the sociocultural impact on how one might show up, right, through the example that you gave. Let's dig in a little bit into a somatic response that is either trauma-based or not, and how that impacts how we show up, how that impacts relationality.
We are still caught up in this bounded being, that this is my body, this is my emotion, this is my somatic reaction. We can't see the network that's acting on me and how it's shaping my emotions. Lisa Barrett Feldman, who does research on emotions, I would recommend her book, Emotions Are Made, I think it's something like that. And she's talking about how emotions are constructed. The constructed theory of emotions is her work. And this classic idea of emotions is that emotions are triggered. They're just mine. And so this is where EQ and relational intelligence comes in. Emotional intelligence is about recognizing my emotions and then learning to name them and learning to soothe myself, learning how to appropriately express. I'm not saying that there isn't a utility in that, right? There absolutely. Right. But we have to step back and say, how does that emotion get triggered? That word triggered is often associated as it's internal rather than seeing this loop that's deeply connected to. Like, how come a word triggers somebody to, and triggers within quotes, triggers somebody to get so angry, right? Because we're not seeing that there is, words are windows into worlds. That's what I often say. That there are many more worlds operating than just my reactivity. And I do this in my organization all the time. I was a director of training. I had people working for me. And when we were going to have a meeting, if somebody was upset or looked upset, I didn't right away assume that that was theirs to take care of. I would say, if it was Mark, I would say, hey, Mark, we have 5 minutes to go into this meeting. You're looking really like something is challenging. Do you want to talk about it? That was the inquiry. I didn't take it as a private thing. And he, by the way, this was in a context of a relationship where we had built that to talk about one's emotion was to be in confidence. It was to not be like you will be penalized. So you have to create a safe environment for that, right? And he had the choice to say, yeah, but something is going on. It's at home. I don't want to talk. Or just that expression, something's going on. My kid's principal called me and I'm just preoccupied. Okay, that care, I can bring it into the meeting. And I can say, hey, Mark, when we finish the meeting, take care of whatever you need to take care of by tomorrow. Get me the report. And if you need more time, let me know. The ways we talk, the ways we engage shows that we are caring for something that is bigger than just someone's individual self.
I also want to just note that this relational loop is a reminder for folks who may be much more comfortable staying in the interactive to move into the rules, to move into the systems and structures. If I'm a white male leader in an organization and someone says, you may think that this inclusion work here is really successful, but I'm here to tell you it's not. I may be tempted to stay in that conversation, in that simple process of relating, and not look at the rules and the systems and structures, which are clearly not being shifted by whatever DEI process I'm trying to put in place, because it's more comfortable for me to think, oh yeah, it's working, it's doing fine. So in this way, we challenge ourselves to hold some uncertainty and some discomfort if we have a high position of power in an organization, by moving along that loop and stepping into those other spaces and acknowledging for the people around us that they're being impacted by those systems and structures all the time. And that's the kind of transparency that relational practices ask of us.
Thank you. It's amazing how time flies while we are engaged in deep, powerful conversation. I just want to say a huge thank you to both of you, Saliha and Mark. Thank you for putting this book out in the world. Thank you for the work that you are doing. It's another Farsight Friday in the can. And Saliha and Mark, thank you again so much.